The courtroom was a stifling box of polished wood and stale air, the kind of place where hope seemed to curdle under the weight of bureaucracy. Rows of benches creaked under the shifting weight of spectators, reporters with notepads, curious, locals and a few weathered faces who looked like they'd seen too many trials to care. At the front, behind a scratched oak table, sat Daniel Kane, a man whose name hadn't meant much to anyone in years. His hair was graying at the temples, his face carved with lines that told stories he'd rather forget. His hands, calloused and scarred, fidgeted with the cuffs of a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his frame. Homeless, veteran, drunk and disorderly. That's what the charge sheet said. Another nobody caught in the system's churn. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pinned tightly back, shuffled papers at the bench. Judge Margaret Heller wasn't known for leniency. Her reputation was ironclad, fair but unyielding. She'd seen every excuse, every sob story, and her rulings, cut like a blade through the noise. The gavel rested by her hand, a silent threat to anyone who dared waste her time. She glanced at the docket, her glasses catching the fluorescent light. Daniel Kane, she read aloud, her voice crisp, slicing through the room's murmurs. Daniel stood, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't look like a man expecting mercy. He looked like someone who'd already lost. The prosecutor, a young man with a slick tie and sharper ambition, cleared his throat. Your Honor, Mr. Kane was apprehended last night after an altercation outside a convenience store. Witnesses report he was intoxicated, shouting and threatening passers-by. This isn't his first offense. The state recommends 30 days in, county jail and a fine. The words landed like stones. Daniel didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. The courtroom buzzed softly, reporters scribbling, a woman in the back whispering to her neighbor. Another day, another case. But then, something shifted. Judge Heller's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, peering at Daniel over her glasses. Mr. Kane, she said slowly, her tone different now, like she'd caught a thread of something unexpected. Look at me. Daniel raised his head, reluctant, his eyes meeting hers. They were tired eyes, bloodshot, carrying the weight of decades. The room stilled. Heller's gaze didn't waver. Your full name, she said. Not a question, but a command. State it for the record. Daniel Patrick Kane, he muttered, voice rough, like gravel under boots. A ripple passed through the courtroom, subtle but undeniable. Heller's lips parted, just for a moment, before she caught herself. She set her pen down, deliberate, and removed her glasses. Say it again, she said, quieter now. But the weight of her words pinned the room in place. Daniel Patrick Kane, he repeated, confusion creeping into his voice. Why did it matter? Why was she looking at him like that? The judge's face was unreadable, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded them on the bench. She turned to the bailiff, a burly man with a buzz cut standing by the wall. Clear. The courtroom, she said, her voice steady but laced with something raw. Everyone except counsel and the defendant. The spectators froze, caught off guard. Reporters clutched their notepads, reluctant to move. Your Honor, one started, but Heller's glare silenced him. Now, she snapped. The bailiff stepped forward, ushering people out. Whispers swelled into a hum of confusion as the crowd shuffled toward the doors. The prosecutor looked bewildered, glancing at Daniel, who stood rigid, unsure if he should be terrified or relieved. When the doors clicked shut, the room felt cavernous, empty except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Heller leaned back, in her chair, studying Daniel like he was a ghost. Mr. Kane, she said, her voice softer now, almost personal. Do you know who I am? Daniel blinked, thrown by the question. No, ma'am, he said, his brow furrowing. Should I? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a small silver locket she wore around her neck, hidden beneath her robe. She unclasped it, opened it, and stared at something. Inside, a photograph maybe, or a keepsake. Her thumb brushed over it, and for the first time, her composure cracked. You don't remember, she said, more to herself than to him. But I do. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. You're Honor, with all due respect, is this relevant to— Sit down, Mr. Ellis. Heller cut him off, her eyes never leaving Daniel. The prosecutor sat, chastened. Daniel's lawyer, a public defender with a rumpled tie and a nervous habit of tapping his pen, looked just as lost. The air was thick, charged with something no one could name. June 12th, 1993, Heller said, her voice steady but heavy like she was unearthing a grave. Fallujah. You were there. Daniel's breath caught. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. Fallujah. The name was a scar, a wound that never healed. He didn't talk about it. Not to the VA counselors, not to the bartenders who poured his whiskey, not to the shadows he saw in his dreams. How do you— He started, but his voice broke. Heller closed the locket, her fingers lingering on it. My brother was there too, she said. Captain Thomas Heller. You knew him. The name hit Daniel like a punch. Thomas Heller. Blonde hair, quick laugh, a soldier who'd talk about his little sister back home, the one studying law, the one he swore he'd see again. Daniel's knees buckled, and he gripped the table harder to keep from falling. Tommy, he whispered, the nickname slipping out, raw and unbidden. The room was silent, save for the faint tick of a clock on the wall. Heller nodded, her eyes glistening but resolute. Tommy didn't come home, she said. But you did, and you brought something back with you. Daniel's mind raced, fragments of memory clawing their way to the surface. Fallujah. The heat, the dust, the screams. An ambush. Tommy's unit pinned down, bullets tearing through the air. Daniel, barely 25, dragging Tommy to cover, blood soaking his hands. Stay with me, Tommy, he'd begged, pressing against the wound in Tommy's chest. But the light in Tommy's eyes had faded, and Daniel had screamed into the chaos, refusing to let go. You carried him, Heller said, her voice trembling now. You carried my brother's body 2 miles through a war zone. You didn't leave him. You made sure he came home, even if he didn't come back alive. Daniel's throat tightened. He hadn't thought about that day in years, not consciously. He'd buried it under liquor and regret, under nights sleeping in alleys and days begging for change. I couldn't save him, he said, his voice barely audible. I tried. Heller leaned forward, her gaze fierce. You gave us closure, she said. You gave me the chance to bury my brother. Do you know what that meant? To my family? To me? Daniel shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. He didn't know. He'd never known. After Fallujah, he'd spiraled. PTSD, discharge, the bottle. The world had moved on, and he'd been left behind, a ghost in his own life. Heller stood, something no one had seen her do mid-trial. She stepped down from the bench, her robe trailing behind her, and walked to Daniel. The bailiff tensed but didn't move. The prosecutor and lawyer exchanged glances, unsure what was happening. Heller stopped in front of Daniel, close enough to see the scars on his knuckles, the tremor in his hands. I've carried your name in my heart for 32 years, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. Every ruling I make, every day I sit on that bench, I think of the man who brought my brother home. And now you're here, standing in my courtroom. And She paused, swallowing hard. I can't let you fall. Daniel stared at her, speechless. The weight of her words, the weight of his past pressed against him. He wanted to speak, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Heller turned to the prosecutor. Mr. Ellis, she said, her tone firm again. The charges against Mr. Kane are dismissed. I'm recommending immediate enrollment in a veterans rehabilitation program with full support from this court. She looked at Daniel's lawyer. Mr. Harper, you'll ensure he gets there. Yes, Your Honor, the lawyer stammered, still reeling. Heller faced Daniel again, her eyes softening. You're not invisible, Mr. Kane, she said. Not to me. Not anymore. She stepped back, climbing to her bench with the same steady grace she'd carried all morning. But before she sat, she did something extraordinary. She placed her hand on her locket, closed her eyes, and whispered something no one could hear. Then she looked at Daniel, nodded once, and said, Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed in the silent room. Daniel stood, frozen, tears streaming down his face as the bailiff approached to escort him out. The prosecutor packed his briefcase, stunned. The lawyer scribbled notes, trying to process what had just happened. And Heller sat, staring at the locket in her hand, a woman who'd carried a debt for 2 decades and, in one moment, had begun to repay it. But the story didn't end there. As Daniel stepped into the hallway, the crowd outside erupted. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. Someone had overheard, maybe a clerk, maybe a spectator, and the story was already spreading. A homeless veteran, a hero, recognized in a courtroom by a judge who owed him everything. Daniel shielded his eyes, overwhelmed, but the bailiff guided him through the chaos. In the days that followed, whispers of Daniel's story grew louder. People began to search for him, not to judge, but to help. A diner owner offered him a job. A local shelter reserved a bed. Strangers left letters at the courthouse, addressed to the man who carried Tommy. Daniel, for the first time in years, felt seen. Not as a failure, not as a drunk, but as a man who'd done something extraordinary and paid a price no one could measure. And Judge Heller? She returned to her bench the next day, her locket still around her neck, her rulings as sharp as ever. But those who knew her saw something new, a quiet fire, a resolve that hadn't been there before. She never spoke of Daniel publicly, but in her chambers, she kept a single photograph. Her brother, smiling, in his uniform. And beside it, a newspaper clipping, its headline bold, "Homeless Veteran on Trial." When judge hears his name, entire courtroom rises. The days after the trial were a blur for Daniel Kane. A whirlwind that felt like a fever dream. The courthouse hallway, choked with reporters and flashing cameras, had been just the beginning. As he was ushered out a side door by the bailiff, the world seemed to tilt, the weight of Judge Heller's words still pressing against his chest. "You're not invisible," she'd said, and those words clung to him, heavy and unfamiliar, like a coat he didn't know how to wear. For years, he'd been a shadow, slipping through cracks in the city's underbelly. Alleys, soup kitchens, the cold concrete of underpasses. Now, eyes were on him, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to run or stand still. The bailiff, a man named Carl with a gruff voice but kind eyes, drove Daniel to a veterans center on the edge of town. It wasn't much to look at. A squat brick, building with faded paint and a sign that read, "Hope Haven." But inside, it was warm, and the woman at the desk, a retired nurse named Gloria, didn't look at him like he was a problem to be solved. She handed him a key to a small room, a stack of clean clothes, and a schedule for counseling and job training. "You're home now, Mr. Kane," she said, her smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. Home. The word felt foreign, like a language he'd forgotten. That first night, Daniel lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. The room was plain, a bed, a desk, a lamp. But it was his. No wind whistling through a cardboard shelter, no footsteps to jolt him awake. Just quiet. He clutched the dog tags he still wore, hidden under his shirt, and thought of Tommy Heller. The memory of that day in Fallujah surged back, vivid and merciless. The crack of gunfire, the weight of Tommy's body in his arms, the promises he'd made to a dying man. "I'll get you home, Tommy. I swear." He'd kept that promise, but at what cost? The war had taken Tommy's life and left Daniel with ghosts that no bottle could drown. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, it was fitful, broken by dreams of sand and blood. But in the morning, Gloria knocked on his door with a cup of coffee and a gentle nudge. "You've got group at 10, she said. "Don't skip it." Daniel grumbled, but went, sitting in a circle of other veterans, men and women with their own scars, their own stories. He didn't talk much that first day, but he listened. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years. Connection. Outside, the center, the world was still buzzing with his story. The newspaper clipping Judge Heller kept in her chambers had sparked a fire. Local news ran segments about the hero of Fallujah, piecing together Daniel's service record from military archives. A grainy photo from 1993 surfaced. Daniel, young and broad-shouldered, standing beside Tommy Heller in their fatigues, both grinning under the desert sun. The image was plastered across front pages, a stark contrast to the man Daniel had become. People read about the ambush, about Daniel's 2-mile trek under enemy fire, about the medal he'd been awarded but never claimed. They read about Judge Heller's courtroom, where justice had bent toward mercy. Strangers began to act. A hardware store owner named Mike, who'd lost a son in Iraq, showed up at Hope Haven with a toolbox and an offer. "You ever want to learn a trade? I'm your guy." A diner waitress named Rosa, who'd seen Daniel begging outside her workplace months before, slipped him a free meal and a note. "You're welcome here any time." Even kids got involved, leaving drawings and letters at the center's gate, their crayon-scrawled words calling him a hero. Daniel read each one, his hands shaking, unsure how to carry the weight of their admiration. But not everyone saw a hero. Some whispered that he was just a drunk who'd gotten lucky, that one act didn't erase years of failure. Daniel heard the murmurs when he ventured into town, saw the skeptical glances in the grocery store. They stung, but he didn't argue. Part of him agreed with them. He'd let himself fall so far, let the war's shadow consume him. Could one moment in a courtroom really change that? Judge Heller, meanwhile, carried on with her docket, her courtroom as orderly as ever. But those close to her noticed a shift. She lingered longer over veteran cases, asked more questions, pushed for rehabilitation over punishment. She never mentioned Daniel, but the locket around her neck seemed to gleam a little brighter. Late at night, in her office, she'd pull out the photo of Tommy and trace his face, whispering thanks to the man who'd brought him home. She didn't know if Daniel would climb out of the darkness, but she'd given him a chance, and that was enough. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel began to change. Group therapy chipped away at his walls, coaxing out stories he'd buried. He spoke of Fallujah, of Tommy, of the guilt that had chained him. The other veterans nodded, their silence a kind of understanding no civilian could offer. He started, working with Mike at the hardware store, learning to cut lumber and fix pipes. His hands, once unsteady, grew sure. He gained weight, his face filling out, the hollows under his eyes softening. He still wore his dog tags, but now they felt less like a burden and more like a reminder. One crisp morning, 6 months after the trial, Daniel stood outside Hope Haven, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Gloria was there, her arms crossed, a proud smile on her face. "You sure you're ready?" she asked. Daniel nodded, though his stomach twisted. Mike had offered him a full-time job and a spare room above the store. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "I owe it to a lot of people," he said, his voice steady. "Tommy, the judge. You." Gloria hugged him, fierce and quick. "You owe it to yourself, Daniel." As he walked into town, the autumn leaves crunching under his boots, Daniel felt the eyes of the city on him. Not with pity or judgment, but with quiet respect. He passed the diner, where Rosa waved from the window. He passed the park, where a kid on a bike shouted, "Hey, you're the soldier guy." He smiled, something he hadn't done freely in years. At the hardware store, Mike was waiting, tossing him a set of keys. "Room's upstairs," he said. "Don't break anything." Daniel laughed, the sound surprising him. He climbed the narrow staircase, dropped his bag, and looked out the window at the street below. The city hummed with life. People, purpose, second chances. That night, Daniel sat on the edge of his new bed, holding his dog tags. He thought of Tommy, of the promise he'd kept. He thought of Judge Heller, her voice cutting through his shame. He thought of the letters, the meals, the hands that had reached out when he'd forgotten how to reach back. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man, flawed and scarred, but alive. Across town, Judge Heller locked her chambers, the locket warm against her skin. She didn't know where Daniel was, but she hoped, prayed, he was finding his way. As she stepped into the night, the stars above seemed brighter, like they were watching, waiting, for the next chapter of a story that had begun in a courtroom, and was far from over. And Daniel Kane, the man who'd carried a hero home, was finally learning to carry himself.